Can I now turn, please, to the issue of herd immunity?
I'm cautious even of the possibility that herd immunity was achievable at all, as ordinarily understood. And I think that's a caveat. Let us make an assumption that at the extreme example where COVID infection provided lifelong immunity completely, so you get an infection, you will never get another infection. Even that, you would then need to, with the force of transmission we had, achieve, for the sake of argument, around 80% of the population would have had to have become infected with all the attendant risks. That's the key point, which many of the people who didn't understand this did not get. And at the end of June, after an appalling first wave in which many people died, from memory, I think less than 20% of the population had been infected. I wouldn't want to be held to that number.
No, just a broad figure.
Well short of what you'd have needed, even had herd immunity been a possibility. But as I said in my witness statement, I spent much of my professional career dealing with infections for which herd immunity is never achieved, herd immunity as normally understood. So essentially, so that's the first point. The second point is herd immunity was used in two completely different ways, the term was, and this caused confusion to those who were confused by herd immunity, which in my view was a lot of people. Some people were meaning the herd immunity threshold. This is the point you're talking about, the point at which, for practical purposes, further waves are unlikely, which is very high. The modelers were using it in the sense of a gradually increasing levels of immunity, meaning that the effective force of transmission gradually decreases, but not to the point where there's no waves. And I think there was muddled up between those two completely different uses of the term. And frankly, and I touched on this yesterday, there was a large amount of chatter about this by people who had at best half understood the issue. So I think it became very confused. And as you will have seen from my correspondence, my only contribution on this really up to the point of about the 20th of March was to say to people, this is very complicated, please don't talk about it. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I thought that a very uninformed discussion was forming that was not helping policy making.
Is that a reference, in fact, to WhatsApps that you sent to and from the Secretary of State and others in a CSA, CMO, PM group where you caution against the direction that the public debate about herd immunity has taken, and you try to put it in its proper context?
Well, my view was it was a clearly ridiculous goal of policy and a very dangerous one. And I thought a lot of what was being said could have led to considerable confusion, and indeed did. And I think, I've laid out several times in public, and I did in my statement, my view that it would have been inconceivable that this should have been an actual goal of policy, because it would have led to extraordinarily high loss of life, even if it had been achieved, which in reality it would probably not have been in the ordinary sense.
Nevertheless, the phrase herd immunity was, of course, used by Sir Patrick publicly, but by members of government, by some ministers and officials and advisors. Could you just explain further, please, what, if I may call it this, what the problems are with herd immunity? You explain in your statement that the more transmissible an infection is, the higher the proportion of the population needs to be in order for the population to become immune through this herd immunity or population immunity. And we're putting aside completely the question of vaccines. So, as you described, you need to get to a very high level for this ever to work, if it can ever be said to work at all. What problems, generically, may be encountered if you were, for argument's sake, to seek to pursue such a policy? Is that significant part of the population which becomes open to infection, does it still remain at risk from, obviously, hospitalization or death in terms of the impact of the infection?
Well, I mean, the first thing, just to, you say, setting aside vaccines, the one situation, in my view, and I've said this before this pandemic, and, you know, it's a fairly widespread view about those who understand herd immunity, that you would ever aim to achieve herd immunity is by vaccination. That is the only situation that is a rational policy response. So just
Yes,
I just wanted to make that clear. There are, you know, the first question is, can you achieve it at all? And we had no idea whether, even in a theoretical situation, the population would, by natural infection, even get to the herd immunity threshold, first point. But much more importantly, in the short term, essentially what you're saying, if you go up to that threshold, which for the sake of argument is 80% of the population, were that to be the case, all of those people carry all of the risks of an infection. And meaning well, overall 1%, but in people who've got higher risks, older citizens, people with disabilities, people with immunosuppression and so on, very significant risks of mortality. So the impact of that on mortality would be very severe. And I laid this out in a paper around the 21st, I think, of March to Number 10, various other people, because I wanted them to understand this point, which I thought had become extremely muddled in the public debate. This will lead. The only situation where that wasn't going to be the case was if there was a huge amount of asymptomatic transmission we were not detecting. In all other circumstances, we would have been in a situation where very large loss of life would have occurred,
right,
had that been attempted.
So for that part of the population, which is unable to be shielded or cocooned or segmented, however you describe it, it remains at risk of hospitalization, of death, and therefore it just doesn't work because they're already and they remain open to infection. Secondly, in practice, is it possible to hermetically seal particular segments of the population in order that they may not be open to infection under such a policy were it to be pursued?
So I think that you may want to come back to the system we call shielding, but I always thought it was wholly impractical for multiple reasons to try and achieve that.
Right.
And the two, there are two in particular. The first one is, in a sense, theoretical. Let's say theoretically you could achieve a complete barrier between the virus and those people, and my view was that was never going to be achievable. We'll come back to that. These people would have to be in isolation for incredibly long periods of time. And that doesn't matter whether that's the Great Barrington Declaration kind of model or the model that was proposed by Professor Woolhouse or whatever. This is long periods of isolation for people who are very vulnerable, often in later stages of their life. So there were practical reasons. And then I could not see a situation where something which was so transmissible from people who were at least pre-symptomatic, asymptomatic, as we subsequently became confident, would not eventually catch it anyway. So the idea you could somehow provide this barrier struck me as wholly impractical for those reasons as well. So I just thought, you know, the various attempts on this were theoretically perfectly, you could debate them, but they were clearly not going to work, and they were clearly going to lead to significant loss of life. So in my view. So that was why I was extremely cautious of them.
And is there another issue in relation to the notion or the assumption that those people who, through population immunity, become infected, through this herd immunity process, become infected, may not actually remain or become immune thereafter? That there's a risk that they may, in fact, become reinfected at a later stage. So it simply wouldn't work.
Exactly, and
right,
as indeed happened with COVID. And I think there is a big difference, and we are, in a sense, the fact that all of us are able to have this meeting here in an open room is because most people are protected, firstly by vaccination, but they're also protected against severe disease. So even were people who otherwise are not vulnerable to disease to catch disease, their immune system will stop them getting to the point of intensive care or potentially dying. That's different from herd immunity. That's to do with individual protection against severe disease. So that's in a sense, they're not different sorts of immunity, although there is a large amount of technical issues around that. But the fact is, you can get a disease a second time much less severely than the first time. That still means you catch it and still means you can transmit it with many infections. COVID is just one of them.